Hello, I'm Noah Tetro and I'm in Year 6 at Kristen School. I'm doing an exhibition project into the Holocaust and I would like to ask you a few questions. Can you first please introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Benjamin Steiner and I am 80 years old and I live in New Zealand now. And I'm a Jewish person, and I'm a survivor of the Holocaust. And I'm ready to answer any of your questions.
I understand that you were a prisoner in a concentration camp during World War II. Which camp were you in and what year were you taken?
I were taken the Second World War, end of 1943, beginning of 1944. Hungary was an ally of Germany, and the early stage of the war, other countries' Jewish population were taken, but Hungary were not subjected to taking Jews because Hungary was an ally of Hitler. But in 1940, end of 1943, Hungarian government told the German government that they will not cooperate any longer with the Germans military. And of course Hitler didn't like this, and they simply invaded Hungary and started to collecting all the Jews. So I were taken towards the end of early beginning 1944, taken to Auschwitz.
Okay. So how old were you going to the camp and how long were you there for?
I were 8 and 3, maybe a little bit more, not quite. And I were just gone 8.5 years old when I were taken.
Okay. Can you describe what it felt like as you were being taken away?
Well, I did not understood and appreciate the political situation at the time. I simply missed my parents. I was very close to my father and I was very close to my mother, and we used to have a good Jewish community, and I missed them all.
Yeah, I understand. Can you describe your first night?
Well, the first day when we arrived to Auschwitz, it was really a kind of a late afternoon, and I was very upset and I was crying, and I had a little friend I made called Eva, and we were holding hands. She was over 12 years old, she was not quite 13, and we made good friends, and we were very sad. And it was another lady called Mrs. Evie, a Jewish lady who were separated from her family. She had 2 children and a husband, and they were separated when Germans pushed us into those railway wagons. So she saw that I were upset and crying, and she was holding my hand, and she comforted me all the way to Auschwitz.
Okay, thank you. So
And I was very, very upset, and I did not sleep. I was crying all night, unfortunately.
what did the food taste like and how much did you have?
Well, I don't think that I touched anything in a first few days. and I was thinking about anything but food. Not that they had much food. They giving us some brown bread and water, and not much else really. They made some soup, but that's about it.
What did the clothing feel like?
Well, at that time I was still in my own clothes, which were taken off of me about 2 days later, and I were given some old stripy type of a pajamas and a two-piece suit and a rough grey and black stripy suit, and that's what I were wearing for quite some time.
Yeah, and what did it feel like?
Well, it was very uncomfortable, but better than nothing. What can I say? Wasn't my usual clothes what my mother and my father bought me.
Yeah. So, what did you miss the most about home?
Could you repeat this question again?
Okay. What did you miss the most about home?
What did I miss
What did you miss the most about home?
about home?
Yeah.
Well, I missed a care of my parents. I missed my freedom, and I missed my friends and the way we lived.
Yeah. What was the worst thing about the Holocaust?
Well, at that time I did not know anything about the Holocaust, and at that time I simply did not understood the political situation between Hungary and Germany, and I simply didn't know what was going on and why I were taken away from my parents. I did not simply understood. I was too young.
How did it feel to see people die?
Well, at the early stages I did not see anybody die, anybody dead, because I was selected to a special camp of children, wolves, and twins, children. We were taken to Birkenau for an experiment. It was a German scientist and professor called oh, hang on, I got a mental block. I will remember that in a minute.
Mengele.
Joseph Mengele?
Yes, Joseph Mengele, a German scientist and a doctor who demanded on, and that's why he were in Auschwitz to experiment on people, not necessarily all children, but majority were children, and the first few days we just were shoved into barracks, into that triple bunks, and we simply didn't know much about anything. We just were there, and we just didn't know anything until later. They started to picking up every day in the morning between 4 and 6 children, shoved into a van and taken into Birkenau, which is where about 2 minutes driving time. That's where they had the big hospital buildings, and that's where they did the experiments, the medical experiments. And until I were taken, I did not know what's all about. And a few days later, after we settled into that building where they took us, it's more or less were a kind of a waiting place for us, because every day they rotated the children who take them into Birkenau. And each day there is a few people came over, German people, and they did all kinds of measurements on ourselves. They measured our chins and eyes and the heads and the weight, and measured the bones, and all these kind of things they did to us. And they shaved in our head and injected us with all kind of chemicals, and so half the time I just did not know anything what's going on. And at that time I did not see the outside world. I were more or less locked into that room with approximately 30 other children, and we only see the daylight when they took us into Birkenau in a van, and when they returned us. Sometimes they picked up 6 people and only brought back 4. The other 2 just perished.
Did you have any friends there?
Yes, I had a little girl who I were taken from Hungary, called Eva, and she was older than I am, and we were in the same bunk. You know, they had sleeping conditions, like they had bunks, bottom bunks, medium bunks, top bunks. The younger children, because they had quite a few young ones as well, 5 years old and 6 years old. Not all were old as myself, 8 or 10 or 12. And the younger ones were occupying the bottom shelves, the bottom bunks. The medium bunks were round up between 6 and 8 years old children. Myself were in a medium bunk, and Eva, who was gone 12 years old, she got the top bunk. And that's how we were accommodated.
What happened to her?
Well, we had a good friendship going. I had a good friendship going with Eva. Early in the morning she used to wake me up. She used to lean over and she used to tickle my hair and my ear, and that was our friendly togetherness. And one morning they took her, and they took me as well, and they brought me back, and I were practically unconscious. I don't know what they did to me, but I had all kinds of stitches and bandages in my body. Obviously some kind of operations they were doing. And the next morning I were hoping that Eve will wake me up. As always, she used to bend over and tickle me. And she used to say, "Wake up, you lazy boy." And that morning she didn't do that. And I were very weak, and I couldn't look up the top bunk, so I asked one of the Jewish lady who were looking after us, I asked her, "Where is Eve?" And she said that Eve did not came back from Birkenau, from that hospital. And so I thought maybe she will coming back later. Unfortunately, she never did. And I asked the lady that, "Where is Eve?" And she said, "Do not wait for her, she won't be coming back." So I assumed that she is dead, and I cried a lot. I missed her very much. And what's happened sometimes that they took some of the children, 5, 6 of them, and only half of them come back. The experiments went wrong, and when they died, they took them straight into the place where they burned their body, and you never see them again. And that's what's happened to Eva. And I wish I would have died as well. I missed her so much. That was my only very close friend.
What did you do during the day?
Well, during a day, just lying down and didn't do really anything, except if you had to go to a toilet, you asked the person who were looking after us, and they usually, if you're strong enough to able to walk, you could get out of bed and walk to it. They had one toilet, and if you was weak, then you had I don't know how to describe that, like a kind of a plate that you can do your business. There's nothing much really you could do. You eaten what they giving you, and you drink what they giving you, and more or less waiting for the next day that it might get better.
Did you have a tattoo on your arm?
When I arrived to Auschwitz, approximately 3 days later, they giving us the tattoo. They take into a room where they actually cut our hair down. They took our hair, they shaved our head, and they exchanged our clothes. That's when we got that rough clothes, like blankets, made out of blankets. And we had to sit down in a corner, and that's where they had this this electronic gear where they put us a tattoo on our arms.
I understand that Steiner is not your original name.
Yes.
Can you tell us where it came from?
Yes. It's a little bit long story, but if you've got time, I will tell you. When my father is a German, and he born in Hamburg, and he went to Hamburg University and became an engineer degree. And the factory he worked in, they were manufacturing medical equipment. And they sold a large container load of equipment, medical equipment, into Hungary. And every time this factory in Hamburg shifted the equipment, they always sent an engineer with the shipment to demonstrate how the equipment works, X-rays, hydraulic tables, dentist equipment, all this type of equipment. And so my father came to Hungary with all this equipment, and he was demonstrating it in a hospital to the staff, who amongst that staff were my mother, who a doctor. She was also introduced to my father, and my father were demonstrating all this medical equipment. And that's how he met my mother, and they became friends, and eventually the friendship grown much closer than a friendship, and they decided that they're going to get married. In the meantime, the war were getting nastier and got worldwide spread. Germany attacked Russia, and taking all the northern countries invaded. France invaded Belgium, Normandy, Holland, and so the war were very bad, and my grandparents from Hamburg told my father, do not come home because the Germans are taking all the Jews. So my father's name was at the time is Meyer. His surname was Meyer, but that's a Jewish name, and he thought that if he changed his name to something like more German-like, they might escape being taken. So my father changed his name from Meyer into Schneider. And in between that time, my mother got pregnant from my father, they got married, and when I born as Schneider. And so I lived my life as William Schneider, and hoping that the Nazis will not pick me up. Unfortunately, that's backfired because they took my father first. One night they turned up, middle of the night took my father. 2 weeks later, my mother took me into a Catholic boarding school, hoping that the Germans won't be able to find me. However, the Germans came one night to the Catholic convent, and they made an announcement, all Jewish children step forward. So I wasn't going to step forward, but one of the nuns came over and grabbed my ear, and he said, come on, you little Jew, step forward, you heard that they want you. And then of course my very good friend Eve, that's where I met Eve actually, we were holding hands, so when I stepped forward, I dragged her forward with me. I shouldn't have done it, but we were good friends and she came as well. And eventually they took us into a railway wagon that night, and 2 days later we arrived at Auschwitz. And we ended up in the same room and in the same bunk. She was in a top bunk, I was in a middle bunk. And one night I was in Auschwitz, in Birkenau. I was experimented on it, and after they cutting me up and I was stitched up, but I was very weak and wasn't really very well. But in the morning the German officer came with 2 other attendants, and they touched me with the bamboo stick and they told me to get up. They want to take me to a laboratorium, to the Birkenau. But I was very slow. I wasn't well, and I was very slow. So he started to hit me with that bamboo stick of his, and he was saying, hurry up, hurry up. And the lady who was looking after us, her name was Steiner. So Mrs. Steiner came over and grabbed the bamboo stick from the German officer and said to him, please don't hit him, he's not well. He was medicated all night and he's a little bit slow, he's not well. The German officer pulled out his gun and shot her dead, saying at the same time, how dare you touch me, a Wehrmacht officer. Anyway, a minute later, the 2 other companions he had, they went outside, they come back with a 2-wheeler wagon and put her into that wagon and wheeled her out. Now time has gone, and after the war, when Russians liberated Auschwitz, and I managed to get better, and I got back to Hungary to my parents united. That was quite a few years later. And then we had a Hungarian Revolution break out in Hungary, and I were against the Russians, and I were a university student at the time, and I were shooting them with some of my friends. And eventually I had to come to New Zealand because the Germans were collecting, not the German, I beg your pardon, the Russians, Secret Service, and the Russian soldiers were collecting all the people who were involved with the revolution. And then of course the university students were in front line, so I had to leave Hungary, and then I come to New Zealand. When I arrived in New Zealand, the Jewish community looked after me. They bought the Hungarian Rabbi Koda, and an English Rabbi Esther. They bought me my very first saxophone. And me couldn't be speaking English, unable to speak English, I couldn't get a job. So with the saxophone, I got a job just like that. And I never looked back. I earned more money than a rabbi. I earned good money. And however, years gone, and time to time, I got very upset, and it took me some time to recover, to leaving my parents again, and leaving my home, living in a new country. I got very emotional. And one night at the synagogue we were talking about this with Rabbi Koda, and I decided that honor of Mrs. Steiner, who died for me by stopping the German to hitting me with his bamboo stick. He died for me. I decided that for her honor, I changed my name into Steiner. I didn't really like Schneider, because Schneider is not a Hungarian name, it's a German name, and I didn't really like it. And I couldn't really understand why my father from Meyer changed into Schneider, and then I inherited Schneider. But then I realized that he had the same emotion and the same idea that changing his name from the Jewish name into a German name, so he could escape the Nazis to pick him up. It didn't work, of course. But at that time, that's what he thought that he will do. So years later, I decided that to honor Mrs. Steiner, that's the only thing I could do, is change my name into Steiner, because I didn't really like Schneider either. So that's the reason I changed my name.
Yeah. Thank you. Were you scared?
Well, yes, I must admit, I did not felt very relaxed and comfortable. I did scared.
Did you miss your family?
Oh yes. I miss my family, and in New Zealand, New Zealand was very good to me. I managed to get a good job. I earned very good living with a saxophone, and then when I got married, I joined Air New Zealand, and I was flying around the world, and I visited my parents. 9 times I went home and visited my parents, and every time I went home, I got them their favorite cigars and their favorite brandy. So I looked after them, and now that they're gone, I miss them.
Were you tired during the day?
Could you repeat this again?
Yeah. Were you tired during the day?
At that time?
In the camp. At the camp.
Oh, in a camp, in Auschwitz. Well, I very honestly, I don't sort of remember that. All I remember that every second or third day they collected me and took me into Birkenau to that hospital where they were cutting people up and cutting me up and taking all kind of chopped up organs and giving us all kind of a medication, and I don't think it was tiredness. I think it was illness, sickness, not feeling well. You know, half a time not really with it. Half a time we're nauseated, dizzy, not. You know, that's the thing I remember.
Thank you. Were you always kept at Auschwitz?
Always got.
Kept at Auschwitz?
Yes, yes. Always stayed in Auschwitz until the Russians arrived and liberated the camp. And 2 days later, once the Russian gone, the big wave, they just come, looked, and they went. 2 days later, the British arrived with Americans allies, and they were well equipped. For 2 days while we were alone, after the Russians came, the Germans were running away and left behind all the sick and everybody they left behind. They buggered off. And for 2 days we had no food, no drinks, no nothing. And 2 days later, when the British arrived, they were well equipped. They had ambulances and large buses were converted into ambulance and beds in it, and picked up all the sick children, particularly one who was in my ward. All the sick children were put into these buses, and we were driven into Denmark. Denmark were well equipped. They had a great big sanatorium with hundreds of beds and sick people, and we had doctors and they were looked after us. So the British were absolutely fantastic, decent, lovely people.
How many hours did you get of sleep?
I think almost all the time I were half asleep. I'm not quite distinguish when you're awake or when you're asleep. You know, so we had so much. I had so much medication, injections and pills and things that half the time I don't remember that I were awake or I were asleep. It was one of those times that just wasn't with it.
How did you end up in New Zealand?
That was the greatest decision I made. When the Hungarian Revolution went bust, when the Russians took over, I left with about a dozen of my student friends who were also fighting against the Russians. We went across to the border into Austria, and we ended up in a great big building which is they converted into a refugee camp. And the first few weeks they had officials from different countries came into Vienna, and then you had to volunteer that each country those days took so many refugees. America took 100,000, British took 50,000, Sweden took 20,000, Australia took 15,000, New Zealand took 5,000. And at that time I didn't want to go to northern countries, you know, like Denmark and Holland. It's always winter. I wanted to come to a tropical country. And I heard a lot of good about New Zealand, that New Zealand is a tropical country, nice and warm, and the rivers are lovely, and all the naked Maori girls swimming there. And me being 19 years old, I thought, that's the place I want to go. So I registered to New Zealand. And that's how I ended up in Auckland. Of course, I don't have to tell you that it isn't quite like that the way we thought, but it was just as well a great decision, and I'm very grateful for the New Zealand government and the Jewish community.
Do you think there could be another Holocaust?
Now, that is a question that I don't think I'm smart enough to answer. I mean, we Jews, we keep saying never again. And I think the majority of the world would think the same. But at the present, the Middle East is not it's always a problem, and one could not decide or even think about it, that it could be another Holocaust or not. I sincerely hope not, and I'm glad that we belong to a good crowd of countries like United States, Britain, France, even Germany today, and some of these countries are strong and they have a means to defend themselves. I'm referring to a nuclear arsenal. I am confident that Britain and America would not allow to have another Holocaust.
Yeah. Have you ever been back to Hungary?
Yes, I have visited after 5 years after the revolution. The Hungarian government finally giving amnesty to the people who were involved with the revolution, and I flew back and I visited my parents, and it was very nice to reunite and having lots of cuddles and kisses, and I was very, very happy to see them alive. And I've been back 9 times, and until they passed on, my mother died and my father died. And I had no reason to go back to Hungary after that, and I don't think I will ever go back. New Zealand is my home, and I got my friends in New Zealand, and I have a good life in here. Thank you.
How did it feel when you were released?
How do I felt?
How did you feel when you were released?
Released from where? From Auschwitz?
From Auschwitz.
Well, I was grateful for the British, and I was grateful for the medical attendance they gave me. But another 2 years after the war, before I actually met my mother again, and another 6 months before my father arrived back. So it took quite some time for me to be really happy. I was put in from different institutions to one to another, almost like an orphan, because at that time I had no parents. Nobody knew where is my mother and father, and so I was handled as an orphan. So I was very upset, very sad, missing my parents. And I had 18 family members, uncles, cousins, who were perished. So I was all alone in a world at that time, until my mother and my father finally be reunited. And the only reason they were not killed, those two, because the Germans were not kill them because they could use them. Germans were quite quite smart in their nasty way. Anybody they could use, they used them. They used my mother because she was a doctor and took her into the Eastern Front to help the German wounded. And they did not kill my father because he was a very good engineer and took him into Normandy and Peenemünde, where they were assembling the V2 rockets who was bombarding London. And they put my father into an assembly line to put together all those explosives and all those circuitries to bomb England. And that's the only reason they they survived. Every other family member, from grandparents, from the father's side, grandparents from the mother's side, and their relations all perished.
How did Auschwitz affect your life afterwards?
Well, quite a few years I could not talk about Auschwitz. In fact, a good 50 years I could not talk about it, and I didn't want to talk about it. In the past 15 years, slowly I managed to get strong enough to able to talk about it. And time to time I still break down, but now I'm strong enough to say and talk about it. In fact, I'm a guest speaker of many institutions that I go and I talk about the Holocaust. And I feel good about it, that I'm able to talk about it.
Finally, I'd like to thank you for giving up your time to let me interview you.
I am very glad that you asked me, because you and your generation of people should know what's happened. It should not be swept under the carpet. I think it should know that what's happened to our generation when I were young. And let's hope that it will never happen again. Thank you.